Yeah, good morning and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to be here with you and to speak, to discuss about some topics related to integrated pollinator and pest management and environmental stewardship from the industry perspective. Before we dive more deeply into the topic, let's go through some fundamentals. Agriculture is intrinsically entailing a certain impact to the environment and to natural biodiversity because it is about supporting the crop grown at the cost of other living organisms like competing weeds or some pests that are foraging on the crop. The same is true for any means of crop protection, be it chemical like crop protection or any other pest control or weed control measurements. So that's a kind of intrinsic thing. On the other hand, there is a need to equilibrate food production with the protection of the environment and, of course, the protection of ecosystem services in agriculture. An agriculture that would not take that into consideration would not be sustainable. So in order to ensure that, there needs to be a balance between the risk and the benefit of pest and weed control on a case-by-case basis, which is essentially in the focus of integrated pest management and environmental stewardship. And this is by the means of risk assessment and risk management. Let's have a closer look at what is determining the environmental risk of pesticides. Well, risk is a simple equation. It's the product of exposure and hazard. So exposure is a variable and it's depending on various factors like how a product is applied, how the application rate is, the application timing, or the behavior of organisms that may be exposed to it. The hazard, in contrast, which is here the same as the intrinsic toxicity, is invariable. So that means, on the other hand, that toxicity is not equaling risk. I can make that a bit more clear in this little pictures. So an encounter with this guy may lead to definitely a certain hazard, but if there is no exposure, then the risk is minimal. And that's the same actually also for crop protection measures. So toxicity is one part of the equation, exposure the other one, and in practice, a very important one, as we will see. Let's have another look at effects. So as we have already seen, pesticides and other crop protection measures have a genuine impact to target organisms because they are designed to hit target organisms. So now, since target and non-target organisms are not differentially clustering in different taxonomic groups, most crop protection products are not and cannot be absolutely specific to the target organisms only. So, and it's frequently even that market conditions are favoring more the broad spectrum products than the specific products. There may be approaches for a way out in the future, like RNAi technology or targeted applications with digital methods, but this just as a side remark. At the moment, the majority of products, well, we have to deal with side effects and we have to minimize the side effects. So, and this is also recognized by the legislation, which are, so where we have a kind of differentiation of effects in acceptable and unacceptable effects. So what is an acceptable and a non-acceptable effect? This is defined in the legislation of the respective countries where the regulation is valid. And here we see different contexts or different concepts of what is acceptable and what not, because this can be very different between different organisms that we see and that we want to protect. This leads us to the so-called protection goals. So for humans, of course, life and health of the individual are in the focus. When we look at non-target arthropods, however, we look at the population. In the case of honeybees, we look at the colony as the protection goals. And it may even be different between different situations where those non-target organisms may be located. For instance, for arthropods in crop, in the European Union, the protection goal is the maintenance of ecosystem functions, whereas off crop, the protection goal is biodiversity. Continuing with the effects, one remark about direct versus indirect effects, because that's also an important topic. I need to emphasize that the risk assessment is mostly directed to the direct effects of a crop protection measure, like a pesticide. And well, beyond that, there may, of course, also be indirect effects. For instance, the loss of forage for wheat-dwelling insects, or the loss of prey for parasitoids. So this is something which is to some degree hard to avoid, because it's an intended consequence of the efficacy of the products. So those effects are difficult to account for in the risk assessment. Nevertheless, well, they are considered in other contexts. For instance, in the European Union, we see currently quite some discussions whether they should be compensated, for instance, by compensation areas, so that they also find their way into the risk assessment risk system, although it's actually more related to risk management than to risk assessment. Well, and this brings us to the next point. So you have already seen the fundamentals of the risk assessment system in the European Union in one of the previous lectures, as I have understood. That's why we are not looking more closely at the risk assessment, but just jump to the risk management. And we do that with an example, which is pollinator protection in agriculture. So if a risk of a crop protection product cannot be intrinsically excluded, for instance, by the lack of exposure, risk management has to be done. And we remember toxicity of a substance and exposure are the relevant points that are determining the risk. The toxicity is hard to change, but the exposure is changeable. And that's where the majority of risk management measures are having their effect. There are also different measures, like the design of new substances, or measures at landscape levels, but we will come later to that. So, of course, the risk management starts with determining the risk that a substance have. And now we look, in this case example, how this is done for bees. So we have, like always in environmental testing and risk assessment, a tiered system, which is, well, simple tiers of lab studies in adult bees and in bee larvae are where needed, followed by semi-field and colony feeding studies. And if that is leaving still questions, that goes then into the field under realistic conditions. So this is this kind of 3 or 4 tiered system, which is hierarchically arranged and is, well, as you see, going from a very simple or simplistic to a more and more realistic exposure scenario. And just an example, I show you here one of the bigger field studies that we have done. Those field studies can really have quite impressive dimensions. This is a study that we did with a seed treatment product in Germany. The control and the treatment areas were something like 65 square kilometers with 17 to 18 replicates, and the assessment of wild bees, bumblebees, and solitary bees over a whole season. So you see, we have quite a robust data package on which we can conclude in how far a product is safe under practical conditions or may entail a risk. So yeah, I think go through that quickly. This is, well, you don't need to look at that in detail. This is a risk assessment scheme, but it comes down to easy principles. Actually, we go from the tier 1 lab to second and third tier, colony feeding and semi-field, and the last tier field. And along this arrow, it's getting more realistic, but more complex. So if now the risk management is following, and this is complementing the risk assessment. If as the outcome of a risk assessment, a risk under practical conditions cannot be avoided, that needs to be mitigated by appropriate measures, which are mostly targeting at exposure, and those are stipulated in the product's label. You see here a few examples. And this mostly comes down to changes or modifications in the exposure. I give you a few examples on the next slide. When we have the case where we want to protect pollinators, bees or other pollinators from a pesticide, there can be adjustments done of the application timing. For instance, some products can be safely applied in the evening or at night, when bees are not active. Other ones, which are more persistent in the crop, can even be then only applied out of the flowering period of a crop. Agronomic practices can be adjusted. For instance, removal of flowering weeds in orchards before application, or avoiding of spray drift into neighboring crops or natural areas. And of course, last not least, apicultural practices can be addressed, for instance, covering or removing hives which are set up in a crop for managed pollination. There can be also technically quite interesting, partly sophisticated, partly quite straightforward measures how exposure of bees to pesticide applications in crop protection can be minimized. And I show you two examples here. One is a great tool how we can minimize the exposure of bees to foliar applications, like for instance here in oilseed rape. So some products, especially fungicides, but also certain insecticides, need to be applied during flowering because the respective pest is present during flowering of the crop. And this is, of course, bringing up the questions how we can avoid the bees to be exposed. So normally, and you see that on the left side of the slide, I don't know whether you see my arrow, them moving here of the pointer. Anyway, you look at the left side and there you see a conventional application which is spraying the crop over the top. The solution can be the so-called drop leg application, which is extensions of the spray bar. It is kind of hook-shaped structures which you see on the upper right, hanging down from the spray bar, and they are reaching into the crop and spraying underneath the canopy or even from the underside. And you see particularly well on the lower right how that looks like. You're really spraying at a level which is hardly at all covering the flower. So that way exposure to bees can dramatically be reduced. Another technology is to reduce the exposure to seed treatment. Seed treatment is as such a kind of smart way to reduce environmental exposure because it is based on seeds being coated with a pesticide, and that goes into the soil where it's at least, not affecting organisms like bees. However, there have been cases where abraded dust from the seed treatment has got into the outlet air of the planting machine, and this has been when it were insecticides leading to bee intoxications. So you see on the upper right, in the old style machines, the air outlet was directed to the side or above, which had then the potential of blowing out dust. This could be resolved by a technical solution, the so-called deflector, which you see on the lower pictures, where this air outlet stream is split into branches and slowed down by that and derived to the soil, where it's kind of buried in the seed furrow, which is also dramatically reducing the potential exposure of bees. Well, the question now, do those measures work? Are they really protective? Well, I think we are on a good way here. I show you here some statistics which they are held up in some countries by the authorities in terms to measure the cases of intoxication of bees by pesticides. And it's a bit, it looks a bit messy. This is related to different counting systems that have been applied during the time. But if you look, for instance, at the green curve, this is intoxication cases in the UK. There has been a clear reduction from the 1980s to now, hardly any current cases of intoxications. And in Germany, and here, please, at the upper one, look at the green curve since the 1960s, a kind of steady decrease. And currently, we are quite often a stable level of 100 cases per year, more or less, which is corresponding to 0.01 to 0.02% of German bee colonies affected. So quite a low number. So the system seems to be fairly protective. I mentioned that there are also intrinsic ways to avoid effects by the development of insecticides which are of low toxicity to bees. And you can imagine this is not a straightforward thing, because insecticides are designed to kill bees, to kill insects, not bees, and bees are insects. So how to get out of that dilemma? Well, there are a few substances which are intrinsically non-toxic to bees, and here one of them, the butenolide fluoradiphorone, is such an example, which is of intrinsically very low toxicity, so that it even can be sprayed into many flowering crops. How does it work? Well, we have figured out what's the mechanism behind that, because nowadays we are more and more not only looking at whether something is causing an effect or not, but if there is no effect, why there is no effect. This is certainly increasing the level of protectiveness when we understand the mechanism. And in that case of fluoradiphorone, there are two reasons why it's of very low toxicity to bees. One is the low penetration of the active substance to the cuticula of the bees, and the other one is the rapid metabolization of the substance by an enzymatic system of which bees have, and which is also involved in the detoxification of many other substances. But they have a certain variety of those P450 enzymes, which is degrading that substance so quickly that it cannot put a significant hazard. And building on that findings, we are trying to further elaborating that system. So now that we have found what kind of enzymatic systems are detoxifying certain classes of insecticides, that can be very helpful for the development of new substances, because then we can already on the basis of genomic markers determine where we have a high likelihood that a bee will be insensitive against a certain pesticide which is newly developed, even before we have started with the bee testing, which will be very helpful to find in a more targeted way bee-friendly products. So now finally, let's look at a few other examples how biodiversity and ecosystem services can be protected in agriculture, which go beyond the product safety. Well, one is a quite important approach how to keep the natural diversity of insects in the field. You have certainly seen that, like flowering strips, flowering fields, which we see more and more frequently in many regions in Germany, but also in other countries. So this can, for instance, help wild living pollinators and other insects to find foraging and nesting places. I think this is quite an important approach, although there are still questions open. For instance, how can the connectivity of these areas be ensured at landscape level? Who is paying for the yield shortfall? I mean, in Europe, it's very much about subsidies, but this is not the case in many other regions. There are knowledge gaps regarding long-term efficiency, and in some countries, it's also with some bureaucratic hurdles to get it established. So we are working on a tool which will hopefully help to make that more efficient with digital methods. That system is looking at the yield potential of fields. So with environmental parameters of the fields and also the different sub areas of the field and yield statistic of the last years, it's possible to calculate which are the least profitable parts of the field, so that the farmer can take into consideration where, for instance, he can set up this kind of semi-natural habitats without losing the best parts of his farmland. So that could lead to a compromise between the protection of insect populations and of yield. Other ways that can be done is, well, instead of finding this kind of balance, even including natural diversity in agricultural production systems, for instance, banker plants and trap crops, where we, in the case of banker plants, attract natural enemies of pests that want to be controlled in the crop by providing them alternative hosts which are living in these banker plants and which keep up their natural enemy populations, which would be collapsing in the crop after they have decimated their hosts. In the banker plants, they can be held stable and released at a certain point of time by mowing those plants so that they have to go in the crop again. Trap crops are a bit of a similar principle by trying to attract the pest out of the crop by providing them a more attractive host. And the good thing is both of those approaches can also have multiple ecological functions. For instance, they can also be made out of plants which are positive for the soil quality or which provide forage to pollinators. I think very promising approaches, but also in many of them still more research needed to really roll them out on a large scale. And the last point I would like to show, which is also kind of coming down to the integration of natural biodiversity is in the production system, is the pollination of crops by wild pollinators. I mean, we see, and the more we see, the more we learn how important wild pollinators are, that a lot of native pollinator species play a role in crop pollination. And the problem is that frequently they don't find nesting places or really around the year foraging plants in the agricultural landscape. So there have been different approaches to try to attract them or to foster them. For instance, for carpenter bees in passion fruit growing by providing deadwood, or to alkali bees in alfalfa growing by providing certain soil structures for nesting. And also we know from certain crops that they are benefiting from having natural plant areas, which is attracting their pollinators around. So that is certainly something that can play a bigger role in the future, but we are also just at the understanding of how those systems really work before we can use them at a larger scale. Yeah, last not least, before I come to the end, I was speaking a lot of studies that we are conducting to show or to evaluate the safety of our products. intrinsically, those are no studies which are published in scientific journals, but you can nevertheless get access to them because we make them accessible to the public on our transparency website. So if you are interested in certain studies about certain organisms and certain products, you can go through that link and apply for getting a view to those studies in terms you are interested to get a more detailed impression how those studies and how their results are looking like. So that was a quick run through the topic. I hope it was of interest, and if there is time, I will of course be happy to try to answer your questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think in the interest of time, we're not going to entertain a lot of questions right now, but I do see one that's sort of specific to the talk that you just gave, and that was submitted by Wolf. His question is the efficacy of pesticide negatively affected by the drop leg technology? So I guess he's concerned that there's less percentage of the plant being exposed to treatment when you're spraying the underside of the plants instead of over the top.
This is a very good question because this has really been a concern. And yes, partly no. It depends very much on the product. It depends on the crop and it depends on the pest. For instance, example, oilseed rape, when you treat against pollen beetle, which are located in the flower, there is a less good efficacy. When you treat with a fungicide against fungi, which are typically on the underside of the canopy, there can even be a better efficacy. So to use this tool, it's really important to have a look at the specific scenario under consideration.
Okay, we do have a few more questions that are coming to the panelists via chat. But again, I'd like to give Bruce Hall some of our attention for now. And when we have a moment, we can go back and address some of these lingering thoughts that the panelists are able to see. So with that, Bruce, if you want to take it away, you're more than welcome.
Hey, thank you, Natalie. Share my screen real quick. Okay, well, thank you and hello. Olivia, thank you for the introduction. I'd also like to thank the coordinators of this course for inviting me to share Wymans' perspective on IPPM. But really, I mean, most importantly, thank you to the students enrolled in this course and for your interest in not only IPPM, but environmental stewardship and food production as a whole. Today, I promised that Christian and I did not coordinate our presentations in any way whatsoever. I'm thankful that he sort of gave a very broad overview of pesticides, habitat, IPM, et cetera, some techniques involved. I'm going to try and focus a little bit more on some of our firsthand experiences on our farms and just try to give an insight to our line of thinking, our approach over the years, what that incremental approach has even looked like, where we're at today, and just some general thoughts, lessons learned, and where we're as a company trying to head in the future. So briefly, oh, slide's not working. There we go. Real briefly, I just wanted to give an intro to Wymans, who we are. And so we're a small company, family-owned, fourth generation. We were founded in 1874 in Maine, which is, for those of you in Germany, if you don't know, that's the northeasternmost state in the US. We're pretty much surrounded almost entirely by Canada. The company originally was founded actually in the seafood industry. We were canning seafood, so sardines and clams primarily. Over the years, we segued into wild blueberries. And today we are still centered and focused around wild blueberries as our core product offerings. But we're really a fruit company today. And earlier this year, I'm very proud and happy to say this now. We are now the #1 brand of frozen fruit in the United States. So it's extremely exciting for our little tiny company who competes against much larger players in the market. And for those of you out there who may be Wymans consumers of Wymans products, I thank you. Wymans also has had a what I would now, I guess, term as a long-term relationship with Penn State University, in particular the Center for Pollinator Research. This relationship predates my employment at Wymans. It goes back to the early days of when colony collapse disorder really first made headlines throughout the world. It is important to know, I think, that, what is our company mission? Why do we do what we do? Ultimately, our goal is we want people to just eat more fruit. Fruit is healthy. You should eat it. It turns out that both Americans and Europeans and Canadians so most Western civilizations do not consume the recommended amount of fruit. Our mission and everything we do is guided by 2 core values. And these core values play out throughout this presentation. And really, they're a part of who we are. We don't even really think about these anymore. It's just what we do. And they do the right thing always. And that means for our business, for our community, our partners that we do business with, and also to our employees, and then always seek a better way to do things. Our farms in particular, we have 4 farm locations. We are spread across Maine in the US, and in Canada, we have farm locations in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. It's important to note that we own 50,000 acres of land, of which we only farm approximately 11,000 acres. With that being said, we also maintain approximately 1,300 acres of pollinator habitat. We grow wild blueberries predominantly. That's our primary crop that we grow. We also grow cranberries. And as you saw on the previous slide, we sell any number of fruit products that in our retail blends. In 2017, we actually implemented formally our integrated pest and pollinator management program at Wymans. And so, it took a lot of what we'd already had in place and really just elevated pollinators and pollinator habitat to have a defined management program that we were writing down and that we were following and improving upon year over year. I'm not sure. I've asked some people who originally authored and proposed the philosophy of IPPEM. As far as we can tell, Wymans is the first commercial farm to ever formally deploy the strategy. What are wild blueberries? Taxonomically, wild blueberries are Vaccinium angustifolium. For those of you in Europe, you may often hear of wild blueberries also being referred to as bilberries. That's a different species of Vaccinium outside of the wild blueberries we have in North America. Their native range is eastern Canada, the US, south to the southern Appalachia, west through the Great Lakes, Manitoba area, and north throughout Ontario and Quebec. It is important to know that in Maine and Canadian Maritimes in particular, wild blueberries are actually the dominant species of a naturally occurring, historically managed ecosystem known as the wild blueberry barrens. What do I mean by historically managed? Indigenous peoples of the area were actually periodically setting fire to this habitat. They would do this to aid in hunting activities, and because they discovered that the year following a fire event, the wild blueberries would experience great production vigor. Wild blueberries were also a key ingredient in pemmican, which is a mixture that also includes tallow and dried meat. And it was a way for indigenous peoples to extend and preserve the meat that they had harvested. Geologically, This habitat is really defined, or it was created by retreating glaciers about 12 to 15,000 years ago. In particular, the Behrends are remnants of what is known as a glacial marine delta. And what it left behind was hundreds of feet of sand and gravel deposits. Today, these deposits of sand and gravel are defined by some pretty extreme characteristics. In particular, they are highly permeable and well drained. Water simply does not stick around in the soil type at all. The soils are highly acidic, naturally range in a pH of 4 to 4.5. There's a very low organic matter. As a result of these harsh substrate growing conditions, vegetation is highly limited naturally to sparse trees, shrubs, primarily of family Ericaceae, Rosaceae, scattered bunch grasses, a few lichens and mosses, and ultimately a near 100% coverage of wild blueberries. Today, the wild blueberry barren ecosystem is commercially managed, and it exists in a naturally occurring permaculture. And so what I mean by that is wild blueberries, unlike their high bush cousins, not have any plant breeding associated with their management. There is no tilling of the soils, and there's no planting of the soils at all. And so the image that you see, the aerial image that you see on the slide, is our farms. You can see a little bit of a mosaic going on, where you have trees and fields. The trees are actually gullies which have eroded away to a base layer of more suitable forest stand soils. And above that erosion level, you have the sand and gravel deposits that I spoke of. Production of wild blueberry plants, it's important to note that they are highly pollination limited, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And then it is worth noting that essentially everything I'm going to present today needs to be kept in the framework of that because we farm and manage a natural ecosystem, our pest pressure is very limited compared to all other crops that are conventional or organic. So we are afforded that luxury, and that we don't have to utilize a lot of pesticides, if any at all at times. Wild blueberry pollination, it's complex. It's very complex. So traditional fruit crops such as high bush blueberries or apples are planted in rows, which make up blocks or orchards. Typically, orchard plantings are grouped by a genetic cultivar, created through a plant breeding program. This grouping of different cultivars by genetics affords typical orchard crops, such as high bush blueberry, the ability to reduce spatial, temporal, biological, and to a certain degree, environmental variability associated with crop production. Unlike these traditional fruit crops, though, wild blueberries are highly variable across all of these dynamics. To give you an idea of how variable, I've shown you a field here, and you can see some plants have more flowers on them than others. And what you're seeing is spatially, an individual plant actually covers up to about 200 square feet of area on the surface of the field. And they shoot up multiple stems throughout the ground, or from below the ground, above the ground. So you have a mosaic of genetics that occur across the landscape. Within an acre, there's approximately 40 million flowers that will per bloom time. The pollination season lasts for 3 to 4 weeks. So those 40 million flowers in this picture that you see here do not all flower at the exact same time. They'll flower, some flower today, some flower tomorrow, and that goes on for 3 to 4 weeks. And it's really driven by genetics. Each of those 40 million flowers are receptive for 4 days. Biologically speaking, so really getting at the genetics of the plant, those of you with a genetics background, these plants, they're obligate outcrossers. In particular, outcrossing compatibility of these plants is non-reciprocal. What does that mean? That means that gene flow, so pollen from plant A can pollinate plant B, but the pollen from plant B cannot pollinate plant A. This creates a high level of inefficiencies within the pollination system. Complicating matters even more is when we're pollinating, this is early May in Maine. The weather is extremely cold, it's wet, and it's windy. To say the least, this is not an environment that honeybees are extremely excited to see when we bring them in. Additionally, wild blueberries do require more honeybee colonies per acre than any other crop. Although almonds use more hives, they have more acres, and that's how they get more honeybee colonies. Wild blueberries are a smaller crop in acres overall, and so we don't quite get to their numbers, but it does require anywhere from 2 to 3 times the amount of commercial honeybee hives. Some agroeconomics. Look, pollination, simply put, is the most important yield factor that we have. By yield factor, I'm talking about the direct inputs that we put on our fields, we spend money on, that explain crop variation. In addition to that, crop input costs are tremendously high. About 50% of all of our input budget is dedicated solely to commercial honeybees. You can see that far outweighs all other categories individually. Fortunately, though, we actually do have a very native bee-rich ecosystem. There's regularly around 120 species of bees found in our system. And in total, there's about 275 species of bees found in Maine. So nearly half of all bee species can be found in our one ecosystem. We know that in the background, there's a background level of pollination that is conducted by native pollinators, and we estimate that to be around 15 to 20%, broadly speaking. That varies quite a bit from one location to the next. I would mention that most of this information that we have at Wymans pertaining to wild blueberry pollination dynamics, I'd have to acknowledge Dr. Frank Drummond, Professor Emeritus from the University of Maine, for his prolific career and work. Simply put, without his dedication and research to wild blueberry pollination biology and ecology, Wymans would not be in the position that we're in today to be an industry leader in IPPM. So that's some of the background, and I really want to get down to more of the, what is it that Wymans is doing? What can we do? And so, as I mentioned before, about 15 years ago, when colony collapse disorder first reared its ugly head, Wymans was well aware that we were exposed to significant risk to our business. As I displayed earlier, the significance of pollination is very real for us. And as a wild blueberry company, no bees, no berries, it was more than a slogan, it was reality, and it stoked great fear within our company. And so Wymans started asking, how can we save the bees? What can we do? And so Wymans began collaborating with Penn State University, the University of Maine, and we embarked on multiple marketing campaigns and public education efforts centered around the no bees, no berries hashtag. We began distributing wildflower packets and educating people about colony collapse disorder, but we wanted to make a more significant and long-term impact. And it quickly became apparent that we needed to take action on our own farms, and we needed to lead by example. And so, we asked ourselves, what can we do then? What can we do to do more? What can we do to do the right thing and seek a better way? And so we thought, well, let's create habitat. Right? It sounds good. We embarked on it. We didn't really know what we were doing when we got started with it. So we had to ask ourselves some questions. What do we want to do here? And so we asked ourselves, can we increase the richness and abundance of native bees? Look, this is largely, I'm not going to glorify this at all. Originally, this was a, hey, if we build it, will they come mentality. And quickly, upon creating some habitat, it became apparent that we weren't just creating native pollinator habitat, we were creating pollinator habitat. It wasn't just native bees that were utilizing the habitat that we were making, but honeybees were just as likely to utilize this habitat as native bees. What they were doing is they were supplementing their wild diet. And that has really got us thinking about, sort of the next steps was, okay, does this habitat also increase the resilience of commercial honeybees? For many beekeepers, wild blueberry is the last stop on a long pollination journey that crisscrosses North America. Honeybees are often stressed from multiple moves and not exactly, as I mentioned before, excited to show up in Maine when it's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, raining, and the wind is blowing 25 miles an hour. And so, this habitat, what was happening is our beekeepers were mentioning to us that they were able to create more honey, harvest more honey coming out of our crop. This honey that they were creating was an additional revenue stream that they were not always counting on as a result of our crop. So that helped to improve the economic sustainability of their business. And then that got us to thinking, well, okay, can we increase the economic sustainability by decreasing the production variability in our own production fields? Okay, if the beekeepers can see a little bit of an economic boost from this activity, what about us? Are we seeing it? And more broadly speaking, we incrementally, throughout this process, which took about 10 years, we incrementally arrived at a greater question. By improving environmental sustainability, can we improve the economic sustainability of our own business, or the farmer, and our business partners, the beekeeper? Currently, we're hoping to answer this question, and we are certainly interested in collaboration efforts to answer that question. Unfortunately, we've had a number of events over the past couple of years that have, environmental events that have made answering this question challenging. We've had some outlier years as far as production goes, and then this year, a pandemic kind of got in the way of some plans. So on to 2021, I guess. So when we set out to modify habitat and create habitat, we didn't want to just create a small patch of pollinator-friendly wildflowers. We wanted to produce habitat that was there all year round. It impacted all pollinator species, and that it provide not only forage, but, as Christian mentioned, shelter as well. We found that was something that was really lacking with some of the wildflower plantings that we had embarked upon earlier. We also want to know what is the richness and abundance of pollinators that we have at our farm locations? Where are they, and when are they there? When are they using it? A given bee species is not always present at the same exact point in time all the time. They move around the landscape. And so we really wanted to get this understanding of who is using what and where. And then in addition to that, we really wanted to focus to get to that economic sustainability of wild blueberry production question is, where and when are pollinators in our crop pollinating our fields? So to do this, we performed some site assessments, and I'll share some of this with you right now. This is not going to be a very data-heavy presentation. It's mostly narrative, but there's a little bit of data here I want to share with you. The first thing we did is look at resources available, floral resources, and we defined this as pre-bloom, bloom, and summertime. And at this specific site that I'm going to share data with you, there was a decline over the growing season. So we see that there's potentially an opportunity for summertime enhancements. We also wanted to know, based on the habitat types surrounding our fields and within our fields, what sort of bee species were utilizing the habitat and when were they using it? And so this is a basic graph that, on the Y, it shows you a habitat type that we defined, and blue is species utilizing that habitat during our bloom time, and the orange bar represents bee species utilizing that habitat post-bloom. And so here you can see that sort of a general decline. We have a lot of bee species utilizing habitat early season, which is when our bloom time is. And it kind of supports the data we saw in figure 1, which is showing a decline in summertime forage availability. Nesting, for us, we used a proxy. Okay, we used bee species life history. We did not go out. We have not gone out and searched for bee nests. We simply say, we know that this species of bee nests in soil habitat, and we know that that species prefers cavities. At this location, 2/3 of all bees are actually soil nesting bees. I want to show you what this location actually looks like and talk about the improvement opportunity that exists. I'm going to switch over to the laser pointer real quick to help guide this. And so here you have an odd year crop field. Here you have an even year crop field. Our crop is a 2-year crop production cycle, where 1 year you have a crop, the next year it's non-crop. So these two fields are what we call split crop cycles. In between is an area that's kind of grown up a little bit. So what happens is when your field crops this year, you have a large burst of floral resources that occurs to the point of 40 million flowers per acre. The following year, there's a rapid decline in those floral resources because there is no crop blooming and no crop production cycle. So have innately, intrinsically here, a back and forth, a constant yo-yoing of available forage to these species, which will drive a population incline and a subsequent decline. So how can we mitigate against that? In this instance, there was a good opportunity to, hey, what if we do some modifications right here and help to bridge that gap a little bit? Habitat on the ground. These are on the ground pictures from the spring of 2013. You're looking at early and mid-successional birch alder forest stand development here. With time, the photo on your left, which is the early succession patch, is just going to continue to infill to the point where it looks more like the mid-successional stand on the right. And so for us, we said, well, hey, what's easiest to do? This area is much more easy to modify than the other area. So we started here. And what we did is we actually mowed 3 different strips through that successional stand. And here you can see one of the strips. We did that so we would stagger the habitat. So you have a certain level of heterogeneity that was created. 3 months later, this is what that mowing looked like, just by getting the sun to the ground. In addition to edge effects, I wanted to throw this slide in real quick to just talk about how significant infield pollinator habitat can actually be as well. Most studies that I've seen really focus on the edge. How do we improve the edge? Well, if you have a really big area, the edge has less of an impact. And so this is data from a field that's actually 500 acres in size. And the data, what you're looking at here is cumulative bee visitation data. So this is data that was collected on 4 different days, the same exact site. The distances are relative to the nearest honeybee yard, which has 48 honeybee colonies in it. And as you leave that yard and move away from it, you're walking a transect directly to the forest edge. We see a decline in honeybees across the transect, but overall, the amount of native pollinators present remains relatively flat and consistent. This is a distance of 1,300 feet. So this shows, as you saw before, some of the nesting habitat where we have a lot of soil bees. Those soil bees, especially the andrenates, they actually nest within our production fields. They're not on the edge. So we actually have a large internal production area pollination service that occurs in our production system. Some of the lessons learned is rapid assessments are a must. And this is really geared towards, I would say, farmers at this point in time. And those researchers involved in taking hard science that's published in peer-reviewed journals and translating this out to farmers to have real-life action on the ground. And I cannot stress the rapid assessment part enough. We've found the sticking to functional groups really aids that process. So whether that's just rapid identification of plants based on plant family or bee genera, whatever it may be, really helps. And ultimately, no scientific training is necessary, but consistency is. You can create your own taxonomy if you're a farmer. You can call things whatever you want. You can call it thing one and thing two. Doesn't have to be the correct scientific name, just be consistent with the individuals over time. Perhaps the most significant lesson that we've learned is that, and this might be frustrating for grad students who only have a couple of years to conduct research, but bee populations are incredibly dynamic. They are not static, and they are highly variable from one year to the next, from one crop cycle to the next. And so a long-term data commitment is essential to define success. Recommendations I would make to anyone looking to get into habitat creation is, first and foremost, seek landscape heterogeneity. And do that both surrounding and within your production area. Create a plan, stick to it, modify the plan if needed. Use data to drive those modifications. And you really need two plans. You need an implementation plan, and really identify opportunities that are easy for you. Don't try to save the world all at once with one full swing. I mean, this is an incremental process. Start small, think big. You also need a maintenance plan, and these maintenance plans should mimic Mother Nature. They should not mimic a consistent periodic maintenance schedule of every 2 years or every 3 years. Do this spatially, do this randomly. That's how Mother Nature works. Speaking of Mother Nature, keep expectations realistic. Mother Nature is not perfect, and you don't have to be. At Wymans, we have done plantings. We really view plantings as a last resort. Take a look around, look at your land, understand your landscape, and try to use what is already ready available to you as a first step. And then, as mentioned before, this is long-term. Take a long-term ecosystem perspective, and in this case, pun intended, be patient. Lastly, I just want to mention a couple of brief comments about mitigation. You know, if you spend all this time creating habitat and you've developed this resource, you need to protect it. And the resource mitigation really begins with communication. I'm a strong proponent of this, and at Wymans, we mandate that we share our farm plans with our commercial beekeepers. We also mandate that our commercial beekeepers inform us of when they've applied pesticides. Beekeepers and farmers are business partners first and foremost. They rely on each other. They are not mutually exclusive. If there was no need for honeybees to pollinate crops, not only would we not have access to all this delicious fruit that we have and vegetables, but the amount of honeybee hives in the world would decrease drastically because there would be no need to pollinate with them either. So it's a truly in this together type of business. There's an equally shared responsibility for each other, as I mentioned, to share those pesticide applications that are being made, or that have been made, or that are being planned. The most common pesticides found in honeybees are actually applied by beekeepers. So it's really important for farmers to know the synergistic dynamics associated with those beekeeper-applied pesticides as well. If you know what they've applied and when they've applied, a farmer can then modify their actions to ensure the safety of bees. I do think that this is a key area of interaction that should receive a much greater emphasis. So if there's sociologists in the course, perhaps that's an opportunity there. You know, in pesticides, know your economic risk. Christian talked a lot about risk. from all across the board. Here, I'm defining risk much more from the business perspective. Ultimately, farming is a business, and so know what your tolerance is, know your operational margin of errors, write these down, live by them. You have to take a vested interest in your own farm dynamics as it relates to your business and the economic risk that you're able to withstand. Once you define that tolerance, what your risk tolerance is and your margin of errors, you then can ask yourself, does the unmitigated economic impact justify mitigation in this case? And I cannot stress enough how much there is to consider. It's dizzying at times. There's a lot of ecotox studies that are done out there from private companies, from government regulators, but we have to consider worker protection. That's probably the most important concern, actually, because workers are exposed to the highest concentrations of pesticides. And so can you reduce that risk to zero? That's the goal, always. But beyond that, environmentally, you've got groundwater, you've got aquatic fauna, you've got terrestrial fauna. You have to be concerned with consumer protection. So what are the residues on your finished product? What market access is available if you do have a residue? You have to be concerned always about resistance management. Resistance management is a core part of integrated pest management. Environmental persistence is key, and at times, unfortunately, the media is ultimately the largest arbiter of this consideration. If a pesticide is a hot topic in the media, then it largely goes out of fashion on farms pretty quickly. A great way to demonstrate, a better way to farmers, provided pre-material reading by Wade et al. 2018, and they did a great job of identifying unintended consequences. Farmers thought they were doing the right thing, but look, there's unintended consequences that exist. How do you develop, best management practices? This is an area that I really look for cooperative extension and hope that is a growing or continuing area of research in the future. We need to know what is bee safe. We know largely what insecticides kill bees on the farm. That's not a secret to us. What we need to know is what is a safe material to use and how to handle it and use it, when to apply it. A common strategy we utilize at Wymans is focused on weed management. We have all this habitat, and oftentimes I've heard farmers say, well, if I have pollinator habitat, then it's just inviting weeds into my field. We find the exact opposite to be true, actually. The floral resources, you can keep them out of your production field pretty easily, and you want to do that particularly in non-bloom times. During times of non-bloom, you want the bees to be out of your field, and you want them to be utilizing that pollinator habitat. So use the habitat to attract bees away from the production area. And this is sort of the hazard and exposure comment that Christian made previously. You can't kill bees if they're not there. And so try to set your farms up in a manner that does that. And lastly, Christian mentioned some technology as well, and I just want to give a shout out to this. It's really important. Sprayers are incredibly sophisticated machines now. They're computer driven. They utilize GPS auto steers. You have nozzle and section controls and automatic shutoffs, self-leveling booms, low drift nozzles. All of these things are amazing at reducing drift to next to 0 feet from your target. But at the same time, utilize spray maps that are generated from onboard computers to verify that your calibrations are correct. And we like to set water-sensitive paper in our habitat areas to determine if we did or did not have off-target drift applications. Just to verify, ultimately, you can lay out that you're doing the right thing. You want to verify that you are doing the right thing. With that being said, thank you. Any questions?
All right. Thank you so much, Bruce, for your talk. And unfortunately, I think just due to time, we're going to have to just jump straight into our class discussion. And so those of you who may have questions who are not part of the class, I think you can feel free to contact Bruce or Christian as questions come up based on the material that they presented today. And if you are signed up for this class, I think we're just going to go ahead and jump right into our group discussion so we have time to get some really good conversations started there. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again in 2021.